Well, as we know, the President will deliver his fifth State of the Nation address this evening. Public policy specialist at the Wits School of Governance, Pooe, and political analyst Lukhona Mnguni joining me now for a breakdown of what to expect, what's realistic, what's unrealistic, what's unfair. Gentlemen, good day to you and thanks so much for your time. And I suppose this is a day or a year unlike any other. Now, just considering sort of what we've had to go through over the past year or so, since the last time we heard from the President, what would be realistic expectations of him? What would be fair? What would be unfair? TK, let's start with you.
Absolutely, thanks for having me. I think the immediate is definitely how they're going to handle the whole debacle around the vaccines. Firstly, the one they've picked, which has been found to be a bit, well, very ineffective, and how they're going to roll it out. That's, I think, the most immediate. And then secondly, it's hopefully what will not turn into platitudes. It's going to be the issue of how do we progress economically? I mean, if you look at the news last week, as you reported, institutions like Musica, Greyhound, and others are shutting down, and that just means, you know, there's less money in the economy. So those, I think, the most two immediate things he can do. Everything else, as it relates to corruption, we know when it comes to this government, corruption is, it's a bit like it's in the ether. They speak about it, but we never really see any results from it.
Lukhona, how much of a measure will government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic actually, you know, has created the expectation? How much of a measure would be fair to judge the President on tonight, if I were to put it that way, considering this is something the entire world has been dealing with? We've seen first world countries handle it really badly as well over the past year. So in comparison, what would be fair, what would be an unfair expectation of him tonight?
Well, Yuveka, I think just the management of COVID-19 has resulted in almost us seeing the President on an oversupply basis. So I do think that on the one hand, this Sona comes at a time when people have been listening to the President a lot through these national addresses, and then this is almost like an add-on in the milieu of those addresses. So it doesn't distinctly becomes a Sona. Of course, I know the hype and the build-up that we have been doing about it, because we expect, you know, much more broader focus on the Sona than on the addresses on COVID-19 management. But I think generally society will view it in that sense. Given that background, then I would probably say people are worried, yes, as TK is saying about the vaccine. But I'm also interested to hear if the President has not relaxed his own strategy in terms of COVID-19 management. We now focus a lot on talking about the vaccine. What have we done with our community screening and testing? I mean, at some point, we made huge fanfare about this. Even the World Health Organization commended us for the work we were doing in communities, tracing and finding the virus, contact tracing, and all of these other non-pharmaceutical interventions that are necessary for you to try and be ahead of the virus. And this is so important, Yuveka, in our instance where we have had serious mutation of this virus in terms of the new variants that we are dealing with. And already given the outcomes in some of the data around vaccines, we know that we probably can't afford more serious mutation of this virus. And one of the things that we need to go back to in terms of COVID-19 management are the more non-pharmaceutical interventions, making sure that we have not relaxed our guard on questions of community testing and screening. I'll be interested in those. And of course, others will be interested in whether have the promises been met by the government to small businesses, to poor people. We still have problems with the social grants, people who have been, you know, given the grant for 1 month, 2 months, and then they've been appealing because it was unfairly taken away from them without their clear knowledge as to why it has been taken away. So I think those will be some of the things that people are looking for clarity on, and of course expecting whether we will see an extension of the grants, particularly the 350 COVID relief grant.
Well, TK, I suppose, you know, we had a lot of things highlighted during lockdown, during our sort of the height of this pandemic as well. And we also heard over the past year that, yes, a lot of these problems existed even before COVID, but were just exacerbated by COVID. And that would go back to the last time that we actually heard from the President. So I would imagine, yes, when it comes to things like unemployment, like you spoke about earlier, when it comes to things like the economy and the state state we find ourselves in, we also will be expecting to not hear the president sort of blame a lot of this on the pandemic. Do we want to go back to where we were a year ago and see where he's made headway on those things, or do we expect that just how the pandemic has made this worse for us to dominate?
I think that's actually a critical point you're raising, because unfortunately, a lot of the messaging that seems to have come out, especially from the governing party and also the government, it seems to be as though COVID is, while it's a dreadful pandemic and it's causing great death, it seems to become the standard answer they give for a lot of things. When everything is wrong, it's blame COVID. And I think you're right in saying we need to actually just recap how did we get to the situation where we have to make, a lot of I think external bias. Here, speaking about PPEs, we have to look at our healthcare system. Well, we got this to the stage because over the last decade, and I don't want to just put it towards one person, as sometimes people do, I put it towards the governing party, the ANC. They've not looked after public health. They've not looked after the economy. In fact, everything has been quite shoddy. And I always raise this point. If you look at rural areas and townships in South Africa, those have been places which have been largely marginalized. And I think that's where you really measure the vision of any government, whether they're dealing well with the rural and township area. Then it's actually been quite pathetic how they've dealt with it. So I think that's how we should really, as you're saying, measure what the government is going to say today in the person of the President Cyril Ramaphosa. And if he simply goes on with a narrative which says, look, COVID is bad, we all know COVID is bad. We've had friends, we've had family members who've been affected and infected by this thing. So we all know that's bad. What we're looking for is leadership. And I think sometimes COVID has sort of done a horrible thing where we sort of lowered expectation of what it means to be a leader. While we understand, and I'm always the first to say, listen, it's not easy to be a president. That's why only a few people actually get to do the job. But there's also an expectation that if you're a leader, you lead. And I think that's where we need to maybe come more critically against the governing party, not just President Cyril Ramaphosa, but the governing party and the government to say, listen, this is not the first time we've been in such a bad situation. Why is it that you've been taking so long to address things that we all know are to be wrong? So don't give us another speech about it being highlighted by COVID. Tell us how we're going to get out of this in the next decade to come.
Yeah. And Lukhona, I suppose of those issues that came way before COVID will be things like corruption and load shedding. And let's add to that PPE corruption as well, where the president's house itself has been tainted if we have to look at what's happened with Kasela Diko and co. And I wonder what he could say, or what you would want him to say. What would you want to hear from him without sort of not acknowledging that, yes, this happened under his very nose as well?
Well, Yuveka, there's not much that I expect, honestly. I know the president will highlight the fact that he has signed an open proclamation for the Special Investigating Unit to do its work around this, and he will follow the lead from those reports of the SIU. So I don't think there is much more he can do, but I do expect that, we don't talk about transparency and accountability as simply conceptual issues. We talk about them in practice. What needs to be done in order for us to make sure that we do not see continued bleeding of state resources in COVID-19 management? I mean, we're already dealing with few resources at our disposal, and if we allow this bleeding of these resources through illegal and illicit means by those who are closer to the procurement process, then of course we are doing much disservice to the country. So insofar as the vaccine rollout is concerned, for example, what waterproof plan have they put in place for the procurement process, using the lessons that have emerged from the PPE, where the National Treasury had even tried to set, certain prices, price caps for certain goods and services around PPE procurement, but those were largely ignored. There were calls for, transparency and publishing of names of service providers, but still that did not stand in the way of those who want to crook the state. So the question is, how do you bolster accountability and transparency in real time so that you close the gaps? Because at the end of the day, it is them as decision makers who must come up with the necessary mechanisms as controls so that the process is done in a way that it doesn't take away resources. But Yuveka, as you mentioned, some of our problems predate the pandemic. For example, one of the biggest issues that predates the pandemic, which is now often made an issue of the pandemic, is the question of the wage bill, the public sector wage bill, where we now say, no, government can't pay people because the pandemic has come. But government had taken a decision not to continue with its collective bargaining agreement with labor already before there was even a lockdown. It was there in the Sona, it was there in the budget speech of February 2020. So it's going to be quite interesting how we navigate this period, because there's clear tension between Labour and the government, and that tension could precipitate itself into a serious public service strike or form of protest within 2021. And I think it's important that the president addresses that and actually shows us how he's going to build bridges between government and Labour, because if he doesn't do that, we might actually be faced with a much more severe catastrophe down the line within 2021.
Well, let's bear in mind, TK, also that we were supposed to have local government elections. Not sure where we stand on that so far. Well, I suppose we're waiting for some kind of confirmation. But of course, while we want some degree of honesty from the president, I suppose we should accept that he's not also going to admit to too many mistakes, because him and then his party, the ANC, have to look good in our eyes on some level as well if we do go ahead with those local government elections this year.
That's certainly the case, especially in election years, that no one wants to look bad, even though we all know the truth. And I think it will be interesting how he approaches that. I think, as Lukhona said earlier on, his strategy, the non-pharmaceutical one, would reason that he himself might also not exactly know the exact dates of the elections, or they'll still be debating, depending on how the waves go, whether they should hold it or not. But I think the critical thing, and maybe I think we have to raise this as a positive, is that COVID has actually shown us where South Africans also do well, and this is where we have to really commend a lot of the good companies we have in South Africa in certain departments, and maybe that's something we can build on for the next 2 decades to say, listen, what has COVID shown us that we excel at? One, we know that when it comes to certain institutions, I mean, a lot of our institutions of higher learning have been great at pandemic has meant from a social science perspective and also from a science perspective. And I'm thinking, as a continent, it will rebound. It might not rebound the way we want it to. So the bigger question will be, how do we now move forward to be able to say, get our industry, get employment in line with where the continent is going, and maybe start to bring, just different thinking about how South Africa should progress going forward. But I think issues such as the elections might give us an insight into whether the government is confident enough to be able to put the mistake up front to say, listen, we've made mistakes, but we've got new ideas that we want to put forward. And I think local government is always the best way to see whether government is confident in what they've been doing for the past 5 to 6 years.
Well, Lukhona, just the last word from you. We've touched on the big ones, the things that are top of mind for ordinary South Africans. But what are some of the other things that might seem to have fallen by the wayside over the past year or so that we would expect to hear from the president? Things that we've not been talking about for the past year, but which we might have forgotten, but are important to our everyday lives.
Well, just to pick you, Veka, from TK's point on, local government and the imperatives there, we know the president launched what he called a pilot site for the district development model in 2019. So I think it's a good time now to have an appraisal of that, what it actually means in reality, what legislative amendments might we need to ensure that the district development model works. Is this going to logically conclude where I think it should, personally, that it forces us to have a conversation about our bureaucracy architecture, whether we still have sufficient spheres of government, and whether we need to relook what we have. Some people have been calling for us to do away with provinces, but not only just from a cost-saving side of it, but also to say, how do you ensure that the state gets to deliver efficiently and prudently to its citizens? And so you rethink. So when you talk about reforms, this is the kind of discourse I'm looking for from the president, that he's been talking about being a reform president, but the substance of the reform is not coming, because a reform means redesigning, it means reimagination of some of the things that you have. And I think the district development model that he has been punting is a good way to start that conversation.
All right, Lukhona Mnguni, Pooe, thank you very much for those insights. And I suppose we'll know when we know at around 7 o'clock this evening.